A quick word from myself. My name's Georgia, and my colleague Carl is also online with us tonight. We run the International Passive House Association, and we've been organising these community meetups for the past few months now, actually. They're every 2 weeks on Monday nights at 9 p.m. Central European Summer Time. If you're not sure what time that is for you locally, we can always send through the time converter tool for you. We also add those events into our calendar, so you can set up a reminder if you're interested in joining those each week. We highly recommend it. We have a speaker from a different APHA organisation each session. So this week it is from the Australian Passive House Association. We've also had New York Passive House and the Spanish Association give a presentation. And in the next few weeks, we've got our Greek affiliate organisation and the Irish organisation planning to join. For those of you who have a Passive House certification, you can receive one further education credit point for each APHA community meetup that you take part in. So if you are interested in that, do get in touch. We have posted the instructions for how to go about that before, but if you're unsure, just let us know. We'll also leave our email address in the chat section tonight. And just a few admin things for tonight. If you could please hold your questions, unless they're really, really burning and very specific to that moment, until the end of the presentation. It's around 20 minutes long. During that time, please add your questions into the chat section, because we'll collect them and then ask them in the order that they were asked. And anything else, let us know if there's any technical issues in the chat section, and Carl and myself will be watching out for that. The last thing is that we will periodically lock the meeting room and then unlock it again. So if your computer does knock you out of the meeting and you have to log back in, but it's locked, just wait a moment. We will unlock it periodically. It's a security measure. So I think that's all from me. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Georgia. I'm guessing you can hear me okay?
Yeah, wonderful. And thank you very much for presenting today.
Oh, that's quite all right. I love being up early. So good, whatever time of day it is, wherever you are. It's fairly early in the morning here. I'm going to be, as you can tell from the title and slide, talking about Passive House, what's it worth? And I'll explain shortly what that's really going to be about. So my name's Andy Marlow. I am, oh, hang on, not on my own slides. I am one of the directors of the Australian Passive House Association, as Georgia mentioned. We're the Australian affiliate for Passive House. I am also an architect, and this is our architecture company. We've been around for about 20 odd years, and in the last few years we've become deeply involved in Passive House. We have also recently, as part of our embracing of Passive House and just building better, formed a new company with some builders that we know called Passive House Design and Construct. And it's fairly unique in the Australian market at the moment in that we only design and build certified Passive House buildings. If it's not certified, we don't go anywhere near the project. And that's a new company, and it's, you know, a few months old and going fairly well for a company that's a few months old in the middle of a pandemic. So what I want to talk about today is it's actually the house on the right hand side there. It was the first certified Passive House in Sydney, and it was our first certified project. And it's actually a journey through the cost of these things. I'm sure it's no different anywhere else. There's a large amount of concern about the cost of building better buildings. And everyone thinks they can't afford it. So through a whole bunch of coincidence, I ended up with a lot of data on this one particular project. So I'm able to talk quite compellingly about what the difference is and what it really does cost. And I'm going to have a crack at that now. So slides. Okie dokie. So just as a bit of a picture, I had to add this slide in. obviously. This is, so we are here, we're in Sydney. We're 34 degrees south, so that turns out to be about on the same, or on the similar latitude to Los Angeles, among other places, and somewhere south of Spain, not too far south of Spain. So we've got a fairly nice climate, to put it mildly. That is certainly plays in our favour. In terms of where we are in Sydney, we are not quite coastal, we are not quite inland, and that's it's a nice part of town. It's one of the northern suburbs, so again, it's not dense, but it's not houses in fields either. Our client came to us quite a few years ago now, and like a lot of people who seem to be the first movers or the early adopters in the passive house world, he is something of a nerd. He's our kind of nerd, which is good. So he had a lot of data on their existing house. They'd been there for a few years and hadn't been able to afford to do anything to it. So as you can see from the graph, so it's the outdoor temperatures and the indoor temperatures, they're fairly closely aligned. We joke that most Australian houses are like living in tents, but actually, when you look at the numbers, they really are like living in tents. And actually, in summertime, you'd arguably be better off in a genuine tent rather than your own home. So there was a need for something to change. They came to us with a brief, as all architecture clients tend to do. And this brief, on the whole, is not too dissimilar to most of the other ones that we get from our clients. They're not after something particularly ostentatious, but they basically want what we're now coming to term a building that works. Now, there's a couple of constraints, or one in particular, that ended up being both the blessing and a curse, and that was their desire not to move this tree. It's a tallow wood. As you can see, it's fairly large, and as you'll see in a moment when you see a floor plan of the site plan, it is almost exactly in the middle of the block of land. It could not be more inconveniently placed if you were really wanting to think about how to develop a block of land. Anyway, the purpose of the journey of sort of this talk and this project is that it started off before we knew anything about passive house. So our firms, as you could probably guess from the name Envirotecture, has always attempted to blend environmental things and architecture into one cohesive whole. And therefore, our sort of default approach to everything in the world was what we call traditional passive solar design. Obviously, a huge number of parallels and a few key differences with passive house. So we were always designing buildings from that perspective. And this project, like all of our other projects back then, started off in the same way. So you can see on the screen, these are sort of the construction build-ups that we were looking at. Nothing wrong with most of them. The foil face blanket in the roof is a thing that we don't use anymore. But most of the other aspects of the design and even the construction on the whole are fairly robust. And the great thing about the nature of the project and why it's proved to be a really useful case study on cost is that we designed the building envelope and its geometry very early on. And as you'll see in a sec, it's heavily constrained, which is, like I said, blessing and a curse. But it meant that as the project evolved from passive solar to passive house, the geometry never changed. So it's proven to be a very good case study. My partner's an academic researcher, so the consistency of the data and the baseline, I understand from her, is very pleasing. The one thing that passive solar or in my world of passive solar that everybody gets very hung up about is thermal mass. The nature of that tree on the site, as you'll see shortly, meant that we were unable to use a concrete slab, which is our default, fairly cost-effective way to get thermal mass into a building. And for a very long time, I'd always been slightly pleasantly surprised and mostly just impressed by the fact that water has a greater heat capacity than concrete to a magnitude of about 2. And I'd always wanted to be able to get water tanks into a building. This is not our building, this is a random photo off the internet. But in this project, because of it starting off as a passive solar home, and because it was going to be a lightweight structure, we were very keen to get thermal mass in. So we managed to persuade the client, and it, to be honest, wasn't that hard, to put the water tanks in. They ended up looking like this. He has not yet put food colouring into the tanks. Lots of people have asked whether he's going to put fish in the tanks. The answer to that one has been no. But apparently the food colouring is probably going to happen at some point for a party or other. So this was our strategy for putting thermal mass in. It ended up being, in terms of passive house, that we could have taken it out and it wouldn't make much difference. But due to where they were in the building, their function architecturally as a screening device and a framing device, but mainly just because everybody kind of liked them. They didn't get taken out through all the cost stuff, which I'm about to start talking about. So this is the floor plan. It's just some of our drawings, but what you can see the geometry. It's not perfect passive house by any stretch. It's not perfectly cubic. Like I said, our climate is fairly forgiving, so we can get away with that. Would we have done it exactly like this if we known about passive house right on day one? Maybe, maybe not. But anyway, this is what we did. And the constraints you can see there, we've got a setback to the front street, which we're right on the cusp of. And also you can see the big tree at the back as well. So we were basically squished between these two key constraints. And it's a 2-level house, fairly open downstairs, deck out the back, etc. And then on the upper level, 3 bedrooms, 1 big bathroom, and a second smaller living space for primarily for music and associated niceties. One of the interesting things from a cost point of view is that the owners decided to not have an ensuite, which again in the Australian market is incredibly unusual for a new home, but they chose not to spend money on a bathroom. There's a full bathroom with shower on the lower level, so they have 2 bathrooms in the house, and they just went, that's enough, there's only 4 of us. So that's the design of the building itself. You can see the little graphics, the little perspectives in the top right hand side of the imagery, so you can get a sense of the building form. It's fairly simple roof forms, which obviously is good, again good from a cost point of view. And you can see just about, you can see some shading, some bolt-on shading that we have over these north-facing windows. We're using the eaves on the upper level. You can't really tell on here, but you'll see later. There's an external blind mounted on the on this big northern window over here, which is downstairs and is the one that basically gets the sunlight into that water tank. So this is really about the money. So let's talk about the money. This project ended up getting priced by several different builders using several different construction approaches, and all of them kind of lead us to learn a little bit of something. So builder number 1, my note over here, promised the world and failed to deliver. This was a guy who was at the time getting stick frames pre-cut in a factory, but still assembling on site, and was claiming that this was, the most cost-effective way to get things done. So this was on-site construction with an element of prefabrication. At this point, it was not it was not intending to be a passive house. So you can see the breakdown here, and in the total value really does matter, of course, because somebody had to pay it. But you can see the breakdown of the numbers in terms of what the sort of where the money was going within the project. If anyone else anywhere else in the world has 2 builders who actually price jobs in the same way, I'd like to move to your country. None of our builders have any sort of consistency across the industry as to how people price things, so piecing this together is always a bit of a challenge. Anyway, so this is builder number 1. So promised the world, told us it'd be a whole lot cheaper than the $900,000 it ended up being. So that didn't go particularly well with the client because he'd pretty much lied it to our face. So we find builder number 2. He's pricing the same job. It's still not a passive house. It's still it's still the standard construction that you saw the drawings of early on. You can see there's some wildly different allocations to the different categories. To be fair to all builders in our instance, they're not always putting the same thing in the same bucket. So some of the leaps are not always easy to understand as to why they are so different. So we move on to builder 2.1. So same guy as number 2, but this is the point at which we've realized that passive house is the best solution that we've got. We've changed the construction approach. So we've moved to trying to use some off-site panelization. The builder by this stage has become a certified tradesperson, so they've got an idea about what they're getting themselves into, but they haven't yet built one. So we're doing a bit better in terms of being prepared and having a robust approach. And as you can see, the cost went up a bit from where we're at before. So you could argue that that's the premium for a passive house, but we won't. I just want to take a quick sideline into the panelization. We being the people living in Australia are not particularly well blessed with options for these things. We have one person in the country of 20 odd million people who actually has a certified passive house component as a panelization product. He happens to be in Melbourne, which is 1,000 k's away, or more importantly, about 11 hours on a truck, and at whatever it is, $240 an hour for a truck and a few truckloads per building, that adds up to cost. So we had prices from the Melbourne guy. There was someone in New Zealand at the time who was making a very similar panel product. And as you can see from the graph, the cost difference between the two was fairly negligible. We also just randomly got contacted by somebody who was bringing not just panels actually, but panels, windows, wall linings, pretty much most of the building fabric at least, out of factories in Estonia, I think it was. Who was desperate to quote one of our jobs, so of course I gave them the opportunity. So their stratospheric looking price here, to be fair, is covered a lot more than just panels. But what was most interesting for us was that the on-site construction was still basically the same dollar cost as the panel system. So as you can see from my comments on the right, like the freight was a problem. If we'd been closer to those prefab locations, the economics would have looked much better. I haven't really talked about the site access, but this house is on a reasonably busy road, and that would have meant panels would have been a bit tricky, certainly doable, but it was a complexity. And for a builder who hadn't done them before, when he ended up with two numbers that were about the same, he certainly was happier taking what he saw as the lower risk approach of just building it all on site. At the end of the day, that's what they've always done, so they don't see it as being risky. But the other key thing, and we've managed to resolve this both with this builder and others since, is that we weren't seeing a decrease in the preliminaries or in their margin. So I assume everyone else's building industry works roughly the same. You end up with preliminaries which cover a whole bunch of the builder's ongoing administration and insurance costs and associated things, and they tend to be related to, well, one of either total cost of project or time. And we weren't seeing any decrease in that allowance when the time was getting slashed by 4 or 6 weeks for the speeding up. And also, again, builders charging a percentage margin on stuff that they supply for, financing it, taking the risk on it, etc., etc. We weren't seeing a decrease in the percentage they are applying. So in Australia, that, depending on the nature of the project, in Resi, it's not uncommon for that margin to be 15%, and they were looking to still charge 15% on what was, a couple $100,000 worth of product. which you could argue wasn't particularly good because it was, a couple of phone calls and arguably less risk than normal. So again, we've solved that since, and that's made the panelisation viable on some projects since this. So that was the story of the panelisation. That's the story of why the panelisation didn't occur on this job. The other thing that's very common in the Australian market is for people to get up in arms about needing passive house quality windows. For those of you who've never been here, our industry average window is a single glazed aluminium window. There is a lot of low-E glass going into those these days, but that's about it. Double glazing is still, I don't know what percentage of the market, but it is still not a big percentage of the market. It's bigger in places like Canberra where it's colder and also hotter, but it's still far from the norm. So what that equates to is that good quality local windows, which still aren't anywhere near passive house, but they are not particularly cheap. So you can see from the graphic the different things that we got priced. The Australian UPVC product is all imported sections and then local glass. Turns out our glass is about, according to my local window manufacturers anyway, about 3 times the cost of good European glass, in particular when you get into triple glazing. So we ended up using an imported European UPVC aluminium clad triple glazed window. UPVC does have a bit of an image problem here in some circles. I'm sure it's not dissimilar in other places. Any of the deep green people, anyone who's sort of knee deep in Living Building Challenge, or those kind of approaches to building, is fairly skeptical about PVC. I'm not saying that that's an unfounded skepticism. I was certainly there for a while, but they have proven to be scientifically good, very cost effective, and they do a really good job of working, and they make a lot of building projects viable, which is incredibly handy. As it says at the bottom, the exchange rate is a risk for us. Our certified projects have quite a few imported, like high value imported components to them. And we have had this recently where just by the passage of time and changing exchange rates, all of a sudden, you've got a project where the cost might have gone up, say 10 grand over the project just through exchange rate movements on windows and HRV units and other things that we just do not make in our country. So that's pretty all I need to say on windows. So look, I guess the upshot here is that the windows we use were actually cheaper than the local windows. We've also learned a few tricks lately about how to design windows so that we need less frame and get more glass, because it's the frames that cost rather than the glass that costs. So this gets us to builder 2.2. So this is the same builder again. We're certified, or we're heading towards certified passive house. We're building it on site, and we've come down. We are cheaper than we used to be, and we've done that primarily because we changed the cladding material. It's got nothing to do with passive house, but it's how we got the job over the line. The client, unsurprisingly, wanted a reality check because they were the first people to get close to building one of these things, and they wanted to know if the price from builder 2 was good. We went to a guy that we know very well, and we ended up with a bigger price. And as it says on the right, there's a couple of reasons for that. He hadn't built one before, but at that time no one had in Sydney, so you couldn't hold it against him. He hadn't done the certified trades course, which it's hard to say whether that was a key factor, but what was a key factor, and we're fairly open with each other, he was very upfront about, was the risk premium. They were being contractually obliged to deliver an airtight building. He'd never delivered an airtight building before, and he vacillated in conversations between, it looks so simple, the detailing's so great, how could I get it wrong, to, oh my God, I'm scared, I don't know what I'm doing, let's just load it with dollars. And as you can see, there ended up being a fairly hefty loading in there by the end of the job. So, all that said and done, what does all this really mean? So, I'm trying to get to the bottom of the question, what does my passive house cost me over the norm? These are the elements that are actually related to passive house as opposed to building a building. So this is the structure, the insulation, windows, HRV, the roof, and the shading device. So basically everything, all the thermal envelope stuff, including the shading, which is incredibly important in our climate. So you can see from those percentages that give or take about 30% of the cost of the building has anything to do with its performance. The rest is, you know, lovely things like bathrooms and kitchens. So what's the premium? Well, obviously it always depends on your baseline, but based on the numbers we've got, and based on the fact that, and I should say explicitly, we ended up building effectively version 2.2, we're looking at about a 16% premium for the things that make the building work. So if that's 16% of our 30%, that's not even 5%. So that's sort of the premium thing. That's where we're looking at. Now, these numbers are the dollar differences based on version 2. So this was the first builder who really kind of got his head around the project. We're looking at a dollar increase, or in dollar decrease actually, in the one that we built of the minus $22,000. And this, again, like I said, had a lot to do with changing the cladding, but we've obviously added in, you know, the walls were built differently. We've got an HRV that we never had in the original design. So we've added stuff in, but we've also taken stuff out. And one of the key lessons that we use when we're talking to clients, and I'm assuming most people today are in the professional bucket rather than the client bucket, is that these guys made a series of decisions in the process in order to get the building to a budget they were comfortable with. So right from the get-go, the deciding that an ensuite wasn't necessary to them saved them probably 15-ish, maybe a smidge more $1,000 just in fit-out costs. So they made the right choices, and part of this sort of talk when it was very first conceived is around the fact that lots of people believe they can't afford a certified passive house, and I'm fairly strongly of the belief that actually lots of people can. Not everyone can, not in the Australian world at the moment, but that lots of people can. It's just a case of making the decisions that help that process. And as you see from these numbers, 30% of the building is to do with its performance, which means that the other 70% is stuff that on the whole is, you know, less impactful. And therefore that's a lot of room to move in if you want to focus on thermal performance and high quality outcomes. So those are those increases in both percentage and dollar terms across the whole project. Now, just to throw a lovely curveball in, right at the very start of this, we actually went to not quite what we call a project home company. So depending on where you are in the world, volume builder, but we call them project home companies. We went to these guys. They were small project home people. They were keen to do something. They were willing to do something that was custom designed. So lots of those guys won't touch that sort of work because they have a formula and custom design isn't it. So they quoted the job. It was the original non-passive house design. They had some exclusions in their price, which were definitely going to add money. We had concerns over their ability to deliver the quality we needed anyway. But they gave us a price, and as you can see from the graph, it was a fair bit lower. When we came to make it certified passive house, they, in the end, very politely refused to tender. And from what we could deduce at the time, it was around the requirement to deliver the airtight building. They'd initially made all the right noises, as people do when they think you're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars with them. But it turns out that actually, no, they weren't really willing to go down that road. So I'm just going to quickly show a few pictures because the building is finished. So, and then I'll get to some conclusions. So this was finished almost a year ago, so August last year. These were taken before they moved in. So as you can see, the tree has remained. The tree is still very healthy. If the tree ever dies, there'll be a lot of very annoyed people. But you can see from that image how ridiculously close it is to everything. And you can see the house sort of levitating over the ground. But the landscaping is done. It will be looking much more integrated than it does right here. So these are our lovely imported windows. It was the first time we'd imported windows. We used a SIP panel roof, which again, our climate is very kind to us that we can use those roofs and not introduce a condensation risk at the wall roof junction. So there are some things in building in Sydney that are particularly helpful that are due to our lovely climate. So just a detail of these tanks. Interestingly, for those who are motivated by these things, these tanks ended up actually, they got freighted from the States. The client's actually American, and he found a supplier over there. We couldn't find anyone locally, but they shipped them in threes and they sleeved them all together. So none of the actual radii are the same. So anyway, this was all CNC cut to make sure the thing actually worked and fitted in this lovely piece of Australian hardwood. We have a very nice staircase, which of course has absolutely nothing to do with Passive House, but it's a nice staircase. So look, conclusions. When you're comparing costs and looking at, you know, Passive House, especially in a fledgling market, the cost premium on a project home is possibly 30%, but to be honest, it really doesn't matter what that is because those people cannot and will not build them. They don't have the skills, they don't have the supervision on site, and their business model is just not geared to delivering airtight, high quality homes. So it really doesn't matter what that percentage is. It could be zero. They just can't actually deliver the projects at this moment in time. And that's incredibly sad, depressing, and yet also an area that is ripe for change. We firmly believe that the cost premium is almost non-existent with good design, assuming you're in custom build territory to start with, and with what we call strategic decision making, which you could just call not spending your money on fancy stuff you don't really need. The window costs, the additional window costs are minimal, and again, through good design, we've learned how to do that better since. So like I said, basically frame bad, glass good is pretty much the mantra for us on that front, and just less windows. The cost savings for prefab are location dependent, but we have managed to, as I've said before, work through issues around preliminaries decreasing to reflect an increase in speed on site, and also a revisiting of how margins are charged on very, very large amounts of money. It's also safe to say that we benefited in this case with refining the design with a single builder. So things like getting to a point with the cladding where we could improve we could get the cost down without fundamentally changing what was the intention, the design intent of the building. And I should also say that the Passive House Design and Construct company that we set up, one of the builders that we've got into partnership is this builder who built this first house with us. So that's proved to be an incredibly fruitful relationship. And also, we do believe that the trades course that they'd done was very helpful in avoiding a risk premium. Ironically, the guy the third builder who came in $100,000 more expensive, since has done the certified trades course and has since just actually a few weeks ago completed his first certified Passive House project, which we're about to announce to the world in the next week or two. So yeah, we really think that knowledge and education through Passive House really helps in delivering a cost-effective building. And on that note, after I don't know how long I've been talking, I will wrap up and take whatever questions there are.